Hello and welcome to Mager Media. I am Biniam Ambachew and I'm your host for Mager English program. Today I have Rediet Tefera. She's the Director of Community Engagement at the Amhara Association of America. We also have Robel Alemu. He's the Communication Director of the Amhara Association of America. Rediet and Robel, welcome to Mager Media and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for
Thank you,
having me.
Biniam.
Thanks both of you for joining us. Please stay with us and join the discussion, and we will return after a short break. So welcome back to all of you. So today we will look back and examine one of the successful events of our century, and that is the Grand Amhara Convention, which was hosted between March 25th to 26th in Washington, D.C. Then we will transition into discussing the legal analysis report that was written and filed by AAA this past March in regards to the Amhara genocide in Oromia and demanding a sense of justice and accountability for those victims. Lastly, we will cover current events, discussing Abiy Ahmed's regime's unilateral and unconstitutional dismantling attempt against the Amhara Special Forces and FANO fighters. We will also highlight the recent Amhara uprising and the wide-scale protests that erupted across the Amhara region. And moreover, we will cover Abiy's mafia-like crackdown and arrest of thousands of Amhara intellectuals, journalists, students, activists, and professors all across Ethiopia. So let's dive in. Rediet, we can start with you. So the Grand Amhara Convention was hosted between March 25th to 26th in Washington, D.C. And it was organized by the Federation of Amharas in North America, FANA, and the Canadian Amhara Societies Alliance, also known as CASA. So what are your thoughts and takeaways from the convention? And how did you assess the Amhara youth involvement as well as engagement in the convention?
Thank you, Biniam. The Grand Amhara Convention being the first of its kind, initially going into it, I didn't know what to expect. Historically, Amharas have chosen to identify and organize as Ethiopians. So it was truly the first of its kind. It was my first time socializing on a large scale as an Amhara. So I did not know what to expect going into it. Looking back now, reflecting on it, it was a very gratifying and educational experience. I met a lot of elder Amharas from different walks of life, different professional spheres that had a lot of information and relevant life experience to share with us. I learned a lot more geographical context into what's currently happening to Amharas in Ethiopia. And how I perceived Amhara political history is that it was in its infancy. And in a lot of ways, a lot of people will say it's still in its infancy. But there's still a lot of history to learn from our elders the past 40, 50 years.
Absolutely.
It was wonderful to see individuals that had the foresight 20, 30 years ago of what was happening to Amharas and that were ostracized by the general Ethiopian population to be honored and receive the respect they deserve. Because I feel like that's an important aspect of being Amhara right now is witnesses, survivors, and victims are actually being denied the acknowledgement of their reality in the ground. So that was a very gratifying experience. And it was also wonderful in a way to see that we weren't really focusing on the current problems our people face because the problems are vast. We really focused on brainstorming ways to move forward. And collectively, we tried to reimagine Amhara's future in Ethiopia. And there was like recommendations given by the convention that has been live streamed and had a lot of coverage from different media. Yes.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Rediet. It is people like you, like Robel and others that are kind of leading the new movements of the Amhara youth that are kind of on the front line, advocating and being a voice for our people. So you're doing very important work. We thank you for that. Robel, do you have anything to add in regards to the convention?
Certainly, Biniam. I think my colleague Rediet did a very marvelous job at covering it. But for me personally, I also was in attendance. And so I got to experience the Grand Amhara Convention and the Grand Amhara protests firsthand. And in short, I would just like to say it was an astounding success of the movement, of the Amhara movement, and a reflection of what can be possible when Amharas from all walks of life come together, get organized, and move in unity towards a common goal. And I think for me, it was very historic. The turnout was marvelous, especially in Washington, D.C., which is a very significant city for the Amhara and Ethiopian diaspora, and one of the most important in the world for what we do as Amhara advocates. So in that sense, I think it was outstanding. Regarding the final press briefing by FANA and CASA, I think there was a lot of actionable items that were raised in that press statement. And so what was mentioned was the role of the diaspora, for example, in taking ownership of the movement, calling for those living in the Amhara region in Ethiopia to boycott, their government offices, government-owned banks, government-affiliated individuals, Addis Ababa residents rejecting the Oromization of that city. As we know, Addis Ababa is a city that has deep ties with the Amhara people, as it was formerly called Berera, and overall for a call for civil disobedience. So this is nonviolent disobedience that promotes the human rights of people living in different parts of Ethiopia, and calls to join, participate, and support local Amhara associations, and for the diaspora to stop making remittances, and for farmers to stop paying taxes. And so these are all ways that the Amhara organizations in the diaspora made recommendations for those on the ground and collectively us as a society to organize, act together. And together, I think this would have a profound impact in paralyzing the Abiy Ahmed administration. And so that weekend was amazing. Towards the end, we had the Grand Amhara protest. We gathered in front of the White House in Washington, D.C., and we got a chance to make our voices heard. We talked about the genocide, we talked about the political prisoners, and we talked about a lot of the pressing issues. And we got a chance to see a lot of young people, a lot of young faces also there coming out to protest, being part of the movement. And for me, it was very rewarding to see that, to see this intergenerational interaction and to have that passing over of knowledge. So that's what I would like to say about that, Biniam.
That's wonderfully said. Thank you, Robel. The Grand Amhara Convention, I didn't get a chance to attend, but I will definitely attend, in the next cycle. But it is conventions like that are kind of shaping and setting the agenda, instead of receiving an agenda from what's been happening in Ethiopia. And our people are coming together collectively, and they're making a difference. And this is a huge leap forward for our people. Let's move on to the report that was released by AAA, and that is this past March, the Amhara Association of America released a 35-page long legal analysis report about the Amhara genocide in Oromia region. Can you portray the significance of this report and its relation to the African Commission of Human Rights? And Rediet, you can take this one.
Okay, thank you, Biniam. The report aims to explain the systemic massacre of Amharas in the Oromia region as in fact being a genocide under international law. It looks at the 1948 Genocide Convention, the Roman Statute on Genocide, and other international tribunals of countries it takes those parameters to analyze the facts on the ground in Oromia, and classifies it as a genocide. It also looks at the 10 phases of genocide proposed by Genocide Watch, and looks at every single stage, discusses and looks at the grounds in the facts on the ground in Oromia, and compares it to the 10 phases of genocide proposed by the Genocide Watch. The report starts by giving a brief political history of Ethiopia. It traces anti-Amhara narratives, or like the perceived Amhara hegemony, back to the 1960 student movement, and proceeds to mention and discuss the organization of the TPLF and the OLF in the mid-early 1970s, being completely centered around the anti-Amhara narratives. As mentioned in their manifesto, it proceeds to mentioning how the anti-Amhara narrative was codified in our constitution after the TPLF-led EPRDF came to power and the new constitution was proposed in 1995. And throughout these explanations, it has specific incident reports from back to 1991 till currently 2022. Where Amharas have been subject to ethnically targeted massacres. It mentions how as early as 1991 to 1993, thousands of Amharas were murdered in East and West Hararge and Arsi. Hundreds of thousands were displaced from that region. Between 1994 and 2015, about 10,000 Amharas have been murdered in Oromia in general. Their report is organized in two parts. The first part looks at the 10 phases of genocide. It classifies the first part, which is classification. It mentions how Amharas are classified exclusively as Amharas, not as Amhara women, not as Amhara Christians, Amhara Muslims, but just Amharas, and how kids, infants as old as like a few days old are classified as Amharas. And they are in return subjected to the genocide. It talks about symbolization in Ethiopian culture, which is also a phase of genocide. It gives specific examples like the use of the word neftenya as a slur, and history exclusively given to Amharas. It talks about how Ethiopian Orthodox is used as a symbol for Amharas, and even non-Amhara Ethiopian Orthodox members are massacred during these massacres, and they are exclusively called Amharas, even though it's not the truth. Another one is love for Ethiopia. There's a lot of other nations that are called like Neftenya puppies or sympathizers of Neftenya, simply for demonstrating like a love for Ethiopia and so forth. So it goes through all of the stages of the genocide, including like prosecution, extermination, in terms of like our organization. In terms of organization, one thing we can mention and what we've repeatedly reported in our AAA reports is the organized aspect of the massacres in Oromia region. The massacres are premeditated right before like earlier in 2021, right before the OLF attack Akabale, the Oromia Special Forces evacuate the Kabale, start evacuating. Even civilians have identified this pattern, and there have been instances where civilians have begged the OSF not to leave the area. And it talks about during an attack after the OSF evacuates and the OLF like attack Kabale, even the OLF themselves are organized in 3 stages. One that does like mass massacres, one that goes house to houses, and then one that's like relatively less armed, that go with machetes, that go off making sure people that were shot are actually dead, and they finish off the job with machetes. And then after that, telecommunication is often shut down, which is exclusively run by the state, which just state compliance and active participation. And in our recent reports, we have seen OSF is directly also taking charge of these massacres. And in terms of extermination, another phase of genocide, in 2 consecutive censuses done nationally, 2 million Amharas have been missing, are unaccounted for in the census. Again, census done by the Oromia regional government is highly disputed by Amhara region officials as to how many Amharas live in the area. And then the second part discusses the formal definition of genocide within the current international law. It talks about how genocide requires special intent, and the intent is to exterminate a nation, a race, an ethnicity, or a religious group as such. And it looks at all those different aspects of the definition and sees how the facts in Oromia are actually conducive to this definition. And what is in fact happening is a genocide.
Absolutely. You did a wonderful job, Rediet, of reviewing and giving us kind of analysis of the reports. And these reports that AAA writes and publish are very, very fundamental. And being able to serve justice and accountability. It may not happen now, but it will in the future when the political power in Ethiopia changes, and when we will hold those people that killed innocent civilians and cold-blooded. They will not go unpunished. They will be held responsible. And these reports are primary source of what happened during the actual events, to be able to document these. And so this is a very important work that your team is doing at AAA. Let's move on to the current events and kind of discuss what's been happening lately, and that is Abiy Ahmed's regime decision to be able to dismantle and demobilize Amhara forces without no sense of due process. And then we have seen a very strong resistance from Amhara region, and we've seen the wide-scale protest that's been erupted across the Amhara region. Robel, can you explain why Abiy Ahmed region is trying to demobilize and dismantle the Amhara forces, and provide us a context for the wide-scale protests that occurred across the Amhara region and the significance of this resistance?
Thank you, Biniam. I think this is a very relevant subject matter for what's happening right now in Ethiopia. And really, the Amhara resistance or protests are something that intensified this year in April. So around April 2nd, 2023, there were large-scale protests across the region. And in the days that followed, we saw protests all the way from Kolbo to Minjar, from Dabat to Dejen, from Debre Tabor to Debre Marcos to Debre Burhan, from Marawi, Bahardar, Gondar, Dese, Kombolcha, you name it. So I think it's safe to say that this was one of the world's largest protest campaigns in recent history. And I think this speaks to the significance for the Amhara people, because while the issue of the special forces is one that's very major and critical to this protest and to this resistance, there's also other political questions. There's also other pressing issues that Amharas have faced for the last 5 months, or sorry, the past 5 years since the regime of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed took over power, and before that for 27 years under the Tigray People's Liberation Front. So really, in reality, Amharas have faced at least 32 years of targeted oppression by consecutive apartheid regimes. And so what the protesters have been asking for is quite simple, really. My colleague Rediet earlier talked about the Amhara genocide in Oromia region and our legal analysis report on that. And I think the Amhara genocide in Oromia region has been one of the critical issues that the Amhara people have been opposing. And we saw this during protests in 2022, both by the students' universities as well as other places. in 2021 during another similar wave of region-wide protests under the banner of Bakan, or we've had enough. And so this Amhara genocide, putting an end to it, demanding accountability for these crimes against humanity, for the war crimes, is imperative. And so we're talking about crimes by a number of actors, both state and non-state, including the Abiy regime, including the Oromo Liberation Army, including the Oromia Special Forces, including the Tigray People's Liberation Front, and so on and so forth. And so at the core of this, it's about saving lives, redress for victims, supporting the displaced people, because as we know, the Amhara region is hosting the largest amount of internally displaced people in Ethiopia. And we're talking people numbering in the millions who are either displaced or who are under very severe humanitarian conditions because their areas or homes have been impacted by war, by ethnic violence, and so on. And so this legal analysis report, as well as AAA's complaint to the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, which was submitted jointly with the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria, are our first steps on this side to bring attention to that. But on the ground, the protesters are also talking about that. And so there's that. There's the issue of political representation. Amharas are calling for proportional representation, for democracy, and for removal of Prime Minister Abiy and his Prosperity Party. Remember, Ethiopia is not a country that has seen democracy, that has political plurality. This is a country where opposition figures are banned from organizing, from holding public meetings, who are targeted and detained, in some cases even killed. And so this is a very critical issue, and this is at the core of a lot of the plights of the Amhara people, going back to the inception of this ethnic apartheid system, of the ethnic apartheid ethnic federalism constitution, which excluded Amharas from the process. And so there's other issues, for example, travel restrictions that are targeted against ethnic Amharas traveling to this capital city of Addis Ababa. Addis Ababa is a federally chartered city, meaning that no ethnic region owns it or can claim ownership to it. However, the ruling Oromo Prosperity Party has actually enforced travel restrictions against Amharas traveling from the Amhara region. So these have been enforced specifically in the North Shoa, in the Eastern Gojam areas, and people were essentially identified, profiled. If they had license plates that had Amhara on it, they were banned, essentially. And these could be people who are seeking medical attention, who are seeking to travel for school purposes. And so as citizens, their freedom of travel, of movement in their own countries has been encroached on. This is one of the major causes for the protests as well. There's a lot of political prisoners. We're talking tens of thousands of journalists, civil society leaders, professors, students, youth, so on. And the protesters are calling for the immediate and unconditional release of these political prisoners and an end to the mass arrests. Because currently the prisons, detention camps are being organized throughout Addis Ababa, throughout the Amhara region, throughout the Oromia region, and elsewhere to hold tens of thousands of these Amharas who are just profiled and targeted for their ethnic identity. And then there's also the issue of house demolitions in the capital city. So recently we saw the establishment of a new city administration called Shaggar. And the Shaggar city administration actually districted areas on the outskirts of Addis Ababa that were taken away from the Addis Ababa city administration and placed under the Shaggar administration. And the Shaggar administration was under the Oromia region. And ever since, Oromia regional forces have led a campaign of ethnic cleansing, displacing tens of thousands of families who are non-Oromo, predominantly ethnic Amharas, but also other ethnic minorities, including ethnic Gurages, Dorzes, Tigrayans, and others. And so these house demolitions are very unconstitutional. They're encroaching on the legal rights of these citizens. And we're hearing troubling stories of families being dispersed, facing socioeconomic challenges, children facing trauma, being separated from school, unable to attend school, stories of young children being eaten by hyenas, and the story goes on. So these are just some of the issues that were raised by the protests. And coming to the government response to these protests, the Oromo ENDF was deployed to the Amhara region since April 2023. under Field Marshal Burhanu Jula and General Abiy Ahmed. And these forces have actually involved Oromo forces wearing national defense uniforms, killing, opening fire on unarmed protesters and sometimes innocent civilians. So we've seen massacres of unarmed civilians in cities including Merawi, Kobo, Kombolcha, Debre Burhan, and others. And unfortunately, due to the current telecommunications blackout in the Amhara region, which largely is under command post at this moment, it's been difficult to conduct these investigations. And so this information is being gathered, but the actual number of people killed and arrested is expected to increase as this information is revealed. And recently, Field Marshal Burhanu Jula, in a press briefing, not only denied the killings, but used euphemisms to incite violence and direct hate towards the Amhara people, calling them extremists or shifta, in other words, bandits, blaming them for the crimes of the Oromo ENDF. And coming to the Amhara Special Forces, I think this is also a major point of the protests, and really the government's talking point for this was to say that this was to unify the country through a process of centralizing the regional security force structures. But really for Amhara people, it's clear that there's other ulterior motives to this action, because this action is actually selectively targeting the Amhara region special forces, whereas forces such as the Oromia special forces are untouched. And as we said earlier, the Oromia special forces are guilty of ethnic cleansing in the city of Addis Ababa, the genocidal massacres in the Oromia region, and other human rights violations. So the Amhara Special Forces also played a very critical role in safeguarding peace in the Amhara region, which faces threats from multiple directions, whether it was what we saw during the war in northern Ethiopia with the TPLF and the OLA invading into the Amhara region in 3 rounds, in November 2020, in June 2021, and again in August 2022. And we're seeing indications of this happening again. And this decision to disarm the Amhara Special Forces came after the Pretoria peace deal, a peace deal which selectively ostracized the Amhara people. And this was a war that involved various stakeholders, Amharas being one of the largest, if not the largest, and Amharas were excluded from this process. So we saw a parallel to what happened in the 1990s when the ethnic apartheid system and constitution was imposed onto the Ethiopian people, onto the Amhara people. And this is also a large part of the protest. So we have very serious security threats from these groups, also from the Western frontier, where Amhara shares a border with Sudan. And so the Sudanese forces invaded into Western Amhara on various occasions, including in collaboration with the Tigray People's Liberation Front. And this is happening even now with the tacit support of the Prime Minister's Oromo Prosperity Party. And so these are some of the reasons why the Amhara Special Forces are important for the protection of the Amharas. But really, at the core of it, there's also the issue of disputed territory. So coming back to the Pretoria deal, one of the demands of the TPLF was to be able to re-annex disputed territories, including the areas of Wilkait, Tagare, Alemt, Satitumara, and Araya. And these are areas that TPLF illegally annexed in the 1990s, ancestral Amhara lands, where early forms of genocide, acts of genocide, ethnic cleansing, forced displacement, and a number of other crimes were committed against the indigenous Amhara residents. As a result of the war, Amharas were able to reverse the annexation of these territories, but the TPLF was unhappy, and despite being defeated on the military battlefield, they have managed to negotiate with Prime Minister Abiy in this Pretoria process that excluded Amharas. And so we're seeing the emergence of a new alliance between the Oromo Prosperity Party and the TPLF to annex these territories. And I'll wrap up here, Biniam. I simply want to highlight that for Wilkait and Raya, these are non-negotiable. These two were really major parts of the protests and the Amhara resistance. And the removal of the Amhara Special Forces is an effort to give back these territories, or allow them to re-annex or steal these territories. And AAA sources actually in early April documented TPLF attacking Amhara forces in the Raya Alamata area, supported by the Oromo ENDF, and AAA sources reported hearing the TPLF forces say, "We will re-annex the Raya areas before the summer in collaboration with the Abiy administration after the Amhara Special Force is disarmed." So this is directly what they're saying to residents there. They're disseminating this propaganda. They're already engaging in skirmishes and attacks, not just in the Raya area, but also in the Tadlamt area. And this presents a major security issue for the Amhara region, as well as for residents of Walgait and Raya, who would be prone to more genocidal massacres, such as what happened in Maikadra.
Absolutely. And that is very critical point that you raised, Robel. We've seen the wide-scale protest and resistance in the Amhara region, and precisely that this decision of unilaterally and unconstitutionally, by the way, it's mentioned in Article 52, the powers and function of states, Section 2, Part G, says to establish and administer a state police force and to maintain public order and peace within the state. So the Amhara regional state, it is within legal boundaries to be able to not only establish a special force and be able to deploy them whatever they pleased. So we can already see that this process has failed, right? There's no way Abiy would be successful in demobilizing the Amhara forces. You will actually encourage them to be even more armed and defend themselves. And that's what exactly was happening. Let's go ahead and kind of discuss the last section of today's episode. And that is, I want you to kind of talk to people in terms of what can they do beyond advocacy. I hear this mantra that, Amharas don't have leaders. But there's a plethora of leaders out there that we know of, within the APU, AAA, the various Amhara organizations in the diaspora, even internally in Ethiopia. This narrative and this mindset, I think it needs to change, and that people need to see themselves as the change that they want to see in the world, right? I think Colin Powell once said, effective leaders are made and not born. So they learn from trial and error. And the various organizations that Robel, as well as Rediet, that you guys both are involved in, you are an example of leaders leading in your capacity. And so what can you say to this narrative that of kind of a negative narrative that people that say Amharas don't have leaders? And what can you say to encourage them to become leaders, as well as just help the Amhara movement gain momentum? Rediet, we can start with you.
That's a tough question. Recently I've learned 30%, top 30% of the Ethiopian population is above the age 30. So 70% of the Ethiopian population is actually under 30 years old. And in some cases, in some Amhara cities, 25 is among the oldest in the community, which just shows that we have lost our elders through genocide and through conflict. And it's really our responsibility to learn our history as fast as we can, so that we can learn from their mistakes and we can just try to stop our people from dying. And I would like to also mention the 10th stage of genocide, which is denial. I feel like when youth choose to look away from what's happening, our people don't get justice, and that it ensures that the genocide continues to happen. So one thing I'll say is don't look away.
Absolutely. Yeah, well said. Definitely don't look away. And like I said, you are an example. In the diaspora, we live in a very comfortable area. Are we not? But we care for the people as these massacres are happening in Ethiopia. And people like you are making a difference and contributing to the Amhara movement. Robel, do you want to add to that, please?
Thank you, Biniam. And I think my colleague Rediet really raised some critical points, about the potential of the population in Ethiopia. It's a predominantly a youthful population. And I think we're constantly being inspired by stories of courage. And I really, when I talk about some of the victims of the mass arrest campaign, particularly there was some powerful words shared by detained journalist Abiy Ahmed. He's editor-in-chief of Amhara Media Center. And in his court appearance very recently, he shared the following quote, and I'm paraphrasing. "I was arrested because I do not serve the regime, because the work I do is treated like a crime. Of those of us here, 90% are Amharas. Our human rights are being violated because of our Amhara identity. I am proud of my Amhara identity. It is part of who I am." End quote. And I think there's a lot to be said and to unpack in that quote. But really, Abiy is a shining example of the defiance and the resilience that we're seeing as part of the Amhara resistance. And as we talked about, the Amhara resistance has clear demands despite being a decentralized movement. So it's not like the Prosperity Party or the TPLF, where there's a central committee and they're organizing and they're giving orders to everybody to do these types of things. But really, it's a bunch of concerned people who have managed to organize themselves in response to a need, and that need is the self-preservation of the Amhara people. And in recent years, we've seen that this issue has become more and more of a threat, but really it's also caused and forced our people to organize. And now, the more organized that we've become, the more impactful we've become, the more capable of self-defense we've become, the more capable of advocacy we've become. And naturally, the struggle breeds leaders. And I think there's youth leaders, there's older leaders, and these are people we see on the ground. These are people in the diaspora. We're seeing them in so many forms. And I think the key message is that there's nothing that, prevents people who are watching, who have ideas, from being involved. They can also be involved. They can join Amhara organizations. They can support Amhara initiatives, Amhara medias. Right now, Amhara medias, for example, like Magar Media, are doing excellent work because they're representing the interests of the Amhara people. And there's so many Amhara medias. And what's the significance of this? Well, in Ethiopia, press freedom is under attack. You don't have the ability to get reliable information from state medias. State medias just want to give you or deliver, cheap propaganda to the citizens. And so the importance of independent media is critical. And that's why journalists have been some of the most targeted victims of the mass crackdown against the Amharas. So it's not just Abiy Ahmed. We can cite Gitinet Ashagre, Gennet Asmama, Tariost Antu, Dawit Bagasho, Sennait Ayelo, Tedros Asfa, Firu Tekli, Dr. Asefa Adana, Aragao Sisai, and the list goes on. And so journalists are under attack, and this is where they're a symbol of the resistance, but also it shows you that people are willing to put themselves at risk in harm's way to tell the truth. And that's what we do in advocacy. So there's opposition figures who are arrested, there's activists that are arrested, people like Dr. Wendusen Asefa, people like Meskarem Abera, and the list goes on. So really the takeaway message that I want to impart is that there are people who are showing and being leaders on the ground. And what we need to do is support them, but also ask ourselves, what are we doing?
That's right.
Our people are under attack, and it's up to us to act. And there's many ways we can be involved. We can participate in protests. Right now, it's not just the protests in Ethiopia that are happening. There's protests in the diaspora. Protests are being organized in various cities across North America, across Europe, across Australia. So it's up to individual families to be part of that, to organize them, to join Amhara organizations at a local level, at a national level. If there's no Amhara organizations, to start them. And now the beauty of social media and the internet is that it's allowed people from all over the world to connect with one another and to organize. And that is a place to have conversations. We're having dynamic conversations on Twitter, on Clubhouse, on TikTok. So the resistance and the movement itself is growing at an exponential rate, despite being a new movement. And this is shaping up to be something that's unlike anything else in the world. The Amhara movement is very unique, and the people are pushing themselves to new heights, discovering newfound potential, or not newfound potential, but realizing potential. And I think there's still much more we can do. And so we need to continue on this trajectory, which is very promising. And I think in the future, or when order is restored, Amharas will come to a point when we won't have to worry about a group that wants to wipe out our people being in power, because we will have seized, proportional representation. We will have seized the ability to, preserve law and order. And so these are not extremist things to ask for. These are fundamental, universal human rights. And that's what makes being an Amhara advocate not only commendable, but something that everyone should be aiming to be.
Correct. I wholeheartedly agree, Robel. I am very, I like looking things very optimistically, right? People that always say Amharas don't have leaders, all I have to say is look yourself in the mirror and then ask yourself, what can I do? As long as you're doing that, you are contributing to the movement and helping to bring a change. And so be the change that you want to see in the world. That's the bottom message that I also want to convene. Any last remaining concluding statements that you want to make? I want to give you this few brief minutes to discuss any last remaining, or send any specific message that you want to send. Rediet, we can start with you.
Yeah, it's very straightforward. There have been 85 massacres documented by Amhara Association of America over the past 2 years. Read our reports.
Perfect. Robel?
I want to share a quote, and this is from former US President Theodore Roosevelt. Mm-hmm. And it's, do what you can with what you have where you are. And I think this is a very powerful, very simple quote that captures what it took me a few minutes to explain. And really, it's that everyone can be an Amhara advocate. If you have the time, get involved with Amhara organizations. For example, AAA, Amhara Association of America, could use your support. The funding that actually allows us to operate is contributed by our community. So you can actually support AAA's work by providing monthly contributions at our website at www.amharaamerica.org. You can follow AAA on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok for up-to-date information. You can actually use these public reports that my colleague Rediet mentioned as a resource for advocacy. AAA regularly hosts phone and various types of campaigns to interface with policymakers, with your local representatives, both in the United States, but also this template could be used in other countries like Canada, like countries in Europe, Australia, everywhere. So it's up to you to take the time on a regular basis and to make that contribution. And this is publicly available information now that's being made available so that everyone can be an advocate. We don't have to worry about, petitioning others to cover the plight of our people. Although we're doing that, we're no longer reliant on that, because now Amharas have organized themselves to talk about what's happening against our people on our terms. And this was something that was unthinkable in the past, but now that's different. That's changed. And this came about in a response to a problem, because Amharas on the ground didn't traditionally have leadership for the past 3 decades. The leadership on the ground, the Amhara Prosperity Party, formerly the ADP, formerly ANDM, are an organization that was imposed onto the Amhara people in a process that was not democratic, that did not include actual Amhara people, that were people who were actually enforcers of the ethnic apartheid system against the Amhara people, rather than being there to govern and administer the people. So this was the burden that Amhara people have been dealing with for the past 3 decades. And now what we're seeing is that Amhara are rejecting that. They're saying, we're not going to allow our people to be subjected to be persecuted anymore. We've had enough, bakan, and now we're going to take matters into our own hands and ensure that our fundamental basic human rights are looked after. Yes. And so now this is something that all Amharas, man, woman, Christian, Muslim, Jew, whatever the case might be, can be united to take a stand against. And this should be taken as our fundamental duties.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Robel. And yes, did a wonderful job of giving us kind of a recap of the Grand Amhara Convention, also an overview of the current events that's what's been happening on the ground in regards to the Amhara Special Forces disarming and the wide-scale protests that we have seen. So we know that Amhara forces are the backbone of Amhara security apparatus, and we should do everything in our power to make sure that they will not disarm and actually even multiply in thousands to protect us. And thank you again, Rediet, for coming on the show, as well as Robel. And thank you to our viewers for watching and staying tuned. Please visit our migrantmedia.com to rewatch this today's episode. And until we meet again, take care.